Hi, I'm Rachel Greenberg from Washington, D.C. Throughout my life, I've been presented with opportunities to meet many interesting people. I've shared their accomplishments with my friends, captured their personas in my writing, and now, through Volta Insider, I can share my conversations. For those of you who don't know what Volta means, it is an element of poetry. The Volta is when the rhythm of a poem changes, and this podcast follows that phenomenon, exploring today's art, innovation, and politics. I hope this may be a window for you into my generation and give my generation access to a world they may not know. There are very few things that have the ability to freeze a nation and the world. On September 11, 2001, the United States was tragically attacked, and 14 years later, there are stories about that day that have not been told. I am so pleased to welcome Anita McBride, who was the Bush White House head of management that day. Here is her first-hand account.
I was Special Assistant to the President for Management and Administration, which is an operational position at the White House. It oversees a lot of the administrative arm of managing the White House complex. So there was a lot about the 16 acres that I knew, about personnel and about budgets and about where people parked and a lot of the things that make the place run. Those were the functions that were under me. I had started off the administration as the Director of White House Personnel, helping to transition in all the new staff to the White House that came with President Bush, many of them from Texas, many of them working at the White House for the first time. So I had been in an operational position for those first 9 months of the Bush administration.
Okay. Walk us through that day. Where were you when the attack hit?
I was sitting in the West Wing of the White House. I was actually sitting in the White House mess, which I'm sure you've heard of that. It's the small area that's like a restaurant in the basement of the West Wing where senior staff have privileges to be able to have meals there. And this was to be my last few weeks in the White House because I was going over to a new position in the State Department come October of 2001. So I was having breakfast with a colleague, and we were just sort of talking over what the year so far had been like, the transition, and in 2001, and then also what my new job responsibilities were going to be. And someone, a friend, a colleague that was from the Legislative Affairs Office actually came by our table in the mess and said, "Hey, did you hear there was a plane that hit one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York?" And immediately we thought, well, somebody in a small aircraft that lost their way or didn't know what they were doing, and how horrible, and hope everybody's okay. That was followed by a few minutes later, and we all know the chronology of this, of hearing that there was another plane. And at that point, the Secret Service that were in the West Wing directed me and my colleague I was with to get people out of their offices in the West Wing and get them down into this White House mess area, which is an underground area, presumably at the time believed to be a safe place for people to go. So we started evacuating all the West Wing offices to come into the White House mess, and we were there at a very, very short period of time. I can't even remember the number of minutes, but it was short before we were told just to get out of the White House.
So tell us what you were thinking after the first plane hit.
Well, again, there was a lot of confusion, and certainly no one at the moment that we were first given the information that an aircraft had hit the first tower, no one realized the extreme nature of what this was. I mean, we thought it was an errant plane, but once we realized and been given direction by the Secret Service to evacuate the White House, then you just stepped into action. You just did what you had to do. I mean, I know enough that the agents tell you to get out of the building, then you need to get out of the building, and there is no questions asked. So telling people to run, to get out, the gates of the White House on all sides of the complex, in the East Wing, the West Wing, were all opened. You know, they were operated mechanically by the Secret Service, and they were all opened, and everyone was just told, you know, to run. And people grabbed their purses or didn't grab, you know, anything. They just ran out. And, you know, so I think part of it was not really knowing or understanding exactly everything that was going on. By that point, I mean, we knew both towers were hit. We didn't really realize until we evacuated the White House that the Pentagon, you know, had been hit. And where I was that morning and evacuated, helped to obviously evacuate people out those gates that were open. And the immediate place that I congregated with a fairly large group of people was in Lafayette Park, which is on the north side of the White House. Again, we didn't know at the time, did not understand yet at the time the severity of what had happened. We knew we couldn't go back into the White House. I walked out with Mary Madeline. Mary Madeline had worked for Vice President Cheney. Vice President Cheney was in the White House that day. He had been evacuated down to the bunker under the East Wing. It's called the PIOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. But the staff had been separated from him. So she evacuated like I did, but she had gotten a call back from the Vice President to come back. She went back into the White House. I kept going into Lafayette Park, into that area north of the White House, and began to really gather a group of people around me who were confused and really didn't know what was happening. They didn't know if this was a few minutes they were going to be going back in, or whether they weren't going to be able even to go back and get their purses. And I saw some very, very senior people standing there and open in Lafayette Park, people who were in very senior positions of support to the President of the United States. And I knew instinctively this was not a good place for them to be. I think I also know instinctively, and still do, that, you know, when you're working in the White House, you're always thinking about the work that has to get done. I was never thought about any threat to me personally. I just never did. I just totally focused on the fact that I saw so many people that I knew needed to be in a place where they can continue to conduct their work. And I called, the first call that I made, because I still had cell service for a short time, was I called my husband, who was at an office at 14th and H Street, 2 blocks from the White House. He was the number 2 in command for the Chrysler Corporation's Washington office. And I called him and I said, I'm standing here in Lafayette Park. There are a lot of senior people. And I sort of named some of the names that were there. And I said, I know they don't belong standing out here. Can I bring them to your office? And he said yes. He said he was sending everybody home, but he would leave all the computers on and bring as many as I need to. So I started telling people there, I said, come on, follow me. I'm going to walk to my husband's office. You can at least, you know, be at an office and a phone there. Again, not really realizing that we may have been a bigger target in Washington, D.C., not really knowing that there was another plane, you know, headed at Shanksville, maybe, you know, in Pennsylvania, but maybe could have been headed to Washington. You know, none of those things. Things were moving so fast, really. But I was just acting on getting people to a safe place, in a place where they can continue to do their work. So we ended up that day having about 72 to 75 people, members of the White House staff, from speechwriters to the head of Cabinet Affairs, to the head of the National Economic Council, the head of Legislative Affairs, all working in our space. And Tim's office was made, you know, open and available to us. I began assigning offices to different people. I made everyone everyone sign a sheet, so I knew who was there, what their contact number was to sign the sheet if they were leaving. And I've faxed those sheets over to the White House Situation Room, which is our secure area, also right near the mess. But that's the area that has the most secure communications in the White House. And I faxed over this list of who was with me at this Washington office of Daimler Chrysler. And the response I got back was a certain number of people that they wanted to back at the White House, and they made arrangements for them to go back. For it's only 2 or 3.
When you say work, do you mean working on, for example, like infrastructure for the country, or do you mean like figuring out what's going on?
Figuring out, I think most of it at the moment, I knew just figuring out what's going on, being in touch with the people that they would have responsibility for. For example, the head of cabinet affairs. I mean, that's the president's link to every member of the cabinet, so every department and agency. That's a key person. Obviously, that was a person who was in contact with the Secretary of Transportation, for example, who was the person, ultimately charged with figuring out how many planes were left in the air and getting the order, from Vice President Cheney, as authorized by President Bush, to shoot down any aircraft if they needed to, if they did not comply with coming down. So it's just sort of understanding that there were senior levels of people standing out there on the street, and they needed to be in a place where they could figure out what they needed to do to be part of the information gathering for this day. The other group of people that I had with me, which was pivotal for that evening, was the president's speechwriters. They all ended up in an office at Daimler Chrysler writing the president's speech for that night, beginning the research for the president's speech, trying to stay on top of the tons of information that was coming, in. And, there was a huge conference room in Daimler Chrysler, so of course the television was on. We were all watching in real time, like everybody else was, what was happening. All the while that more and more people were getting the word from their colleagues that were with us that this is where we were. So as the day went on, as I said, we had between 72 and 75 people that ended up coming there that day. Speechwriters, as I've mentioned, people from the Domestic Policy Council, so being in touch with what was happening with the markets, what was happening not only with other agencies, but also trying to get a handle on where the other people were on their staff. People scattered. They scattered everywhere. Some went home, some went to other office buildings where they knew they had a friend that was there. People knew they couldn't go back to the White House, but people took responsibility to figure out where their friends and colleagues were. So some of it was that kind of work. Other work was actually the work of the White House continuing. One of the things I remember so much about that day too is at one point when I sort of got a handle on everybody that was in the Chrysler office with us, and I made them fill out a piece of paper so I knew who was there, and we assigned offices out to them. We got the last amount of food that we could at a local deli that was there before it shut down. Is the president's personal aide was with us, Logan Walters, who had made the decision that day to not travel with the president, but a backup person, Blake Gottesman, went with the president that day. And I remember looking at, because the president, as you know, was in Florida, so I remember looking at Logan and thinking, wow, this is one of the most tragic yet historic, days in the White House, and certainly for the presidency. And this was, unfortunately, the one day he chose not to be with the president. And I sort of wondered how he was feeling about that. But again, that was just more of an emotional response to seeing, because I knew how important that position is, what a close and confidential nature that is to be with the president. My husband had done the similar job for George H.W. Bush as vice president and president. So just a lot of confluence of things going on that day, but we had everybody sort of settled. Once I had alert at the White House as to how many people I had, they dispatched a Secret Service agent over to the building, to 1401 H Street, where we were. The building had been evacuated now, except for us, White House staff that were there in the Chrysler offices, and the agent came up to the floor and briefed us on what was going on. And I remember him walking in and saying, well, who's in charge here, and how did people get here? And everybody that was there sitting in the conference room all, looked at me because I was responsible for bringing them there, and it really hadn't hit me until that moment, again, that I was responsible for them and did bring them there and acted quickly enough and acted, in a way that was, I think, necessary for the moment. And so the Secret Service locked down our building so no one could enter 1401 H Street unless they had a White House pass. And we worked there in a somewhat secure environment until the majority of people left by 6 or 6:30 that night, when we got word that the president was coming back and that he was going to be landing, at the White House. So the speechwriters all went back to the White House, and many people throughout the day had really just gone home. And but I think a lot of us wanted to be together that day. We were as confused as everyone else. We were as haunted by everyone else as the images that we were watching. The streets of Washington were absolutely devoid of any cars. I mean, I remember sort of looking out the window at H Street and seeing not one car on the road in front of, on H Street, right in front of the Chrysler office. It was very eerie. It was very, very surreal. And it was just a day that, had started out so beautiful. It was one of the most perfect weather days I've ever seen in Washington. Driving to work that morning to go have breakfast with this friend. I remember being right at the corner of 17th and Pennsylvania Avenue before going to park my car and looking up in the sky and just seeing how gorgeous blue it was. It was like a blue that wasn't even real, and the air was so crisp and the day was so perfect. Like, you want to bottle up these days in Washington because they're just so beautiful. And we had just the week before had the first, state arrival ceremony for the first foreign, visitor, President and Mrs. Bush and the President of Mexico. And things finally started to feel like they were settling in after 9 months of transition, and a fairly chaotic transition too, because, we didn't know for 6 weeks in November of 2000 who was going to be president of the United States, because the election wasn't even decided. So there had been this tumult already, and we finally felt like things were settling in, and the day was beautiful. And so early that morning, this all just the world turned upside down, never to be the same again.
Did you worry or think that the White House was the next target that day?
Certainly not after, I didn't think about that, certainly after the first plane, when we were sort of told, a plane hit the World Trade Center. Not even after the second one, but I think once we knew that the Pentagon had been hit, that was really, it didn't take a brain surgeon to figure out this was an act of war. And I never for a moment, I think, thought that the White House would be a target. Again, I felt it was impenetrable. And the reality is, of course, it is not. It's a small, little building that's in the middle of 18 acres of grass. And yes, there may be, restricted airspace, but what really prevents anything from hitting it? I didn't really fully realize that, that day. I think when we began to get the word and the stories that came out about what happened in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that there was an aircraft taken down by the, the heroic acts of average citizens that were sitting on that plane. I think only then that it really did hit us that, this really could have been far worse. It could have been the Capitol. It could have been the White House. I'm not sure we'll ever really know exactly what the intended target was. There's speculation for sure, but it had to be one of those two. It had to be. Hitting our financial center, hitting our defense center, naturally was going to hit one of the seats of government, whether it was the White House or the Capitol. For sure, it had one of those two had to be the target. And that, incidentally, is where Laura Bush was that day, on Capitol Hill. She was getting ready to do a briefing to the Congress, to the Senate Committee on Education, which is Senator Ted Kennedy's committee, Senator Judd Gregg, to their committee on No Child Left Behind. And it was as she was leaving the White House that morning on her way to Capitol Hill that her agent said to her, Mrs. Bush, an aircraft has hit the World Trade Center. Again, she too didn't think certainly that this was an act of terror at that point. In the 2 miles between leaving the White House and that first aircraft hitting the first tower to the time she got to the Capitol, where she was told there when she got to the Capitol that a second plane had hit. So clearly the hearing was going to be canceled, but she was met by Senator Kennedy and met by Senator Gregg, and they went to Senator Kennedy's office, and they sat there, and she
was not taken to the bunker?
Not immediately.
Oh.
She was sitting in the Capitol office. Again, a lot of people didn't know what was happening, and as information was being gathered, people trying to figure out what was going on, she was there for quite some time in Senator Kennedy's office, and she writes about this in her book, and actually Senator Kennedy wrote about it in his book as well, for the two of them to be together on that day in his office. And she said there was a lot of nervous chatter between the two of them going on, a lot of small talk. And she looked at him and she thought, this is a person who has seen so much tragedy, in his life, the assassination of 2 brothers and so many sad things in his life. And she thundered if this was a coping mechanism for him to not really talk about what was happening at that moment. Instead, he was showing her things around his office. And he had painted her beautiful, he was an amateur painter, he painted her a beautiful painting of yellow flowers, and it's signed Edward M. Kennedy, September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
And it was a gift that was given to her. It now hangs in the Bush Library, actually, as one of the artifacts from that day. Senator Kennedy writes about being with her that day in his memoirs, saying what a calming force she was on him and projected calm. And when they did an impromptu press conference at the Capitol once the hearing had been canceled, and one of the reporters from USA Today yelled out to her, Mrs. Bush, what do we tell the children? And her instinct as a mother and as a teacher was, we have to tell children that they're safe and to turn off the television and don't let them see the images that they're seeing. And so the two of them, both Senator Kennedy and Mrs. Bush, write about being with each other that day. It was after the plane hit the Pentagon, where the agents said to Mrs. Bush, well, we need to move you to a secure location. And they said, but only you. And she refused. She said, I'm not going without my staff. I'm not leaving them here. She had a few staff with her that day, and she had the secretary, the head of policy development, Margaret Spellings, who ended up being the Secretary of Education later. But they moved together to a downtown location that was secure by the Secret Service. And oddly, not just a couple of blocks from where I was with the White House staff. But of course I didn't know that at the time.
When did the First Lady and the President see each other again? How long was it?
It's a great question. One of the things that was very frustrating, for hours they couldn't reach each other. And Mrs. Bush talks about that. She was worried about her girls. She was worried about her husband. He kept being moved around. He was not able to come back to Washington. He was prevented, and it was very frustrating for him. So he was being flown from Air Force Base to Air Force Base to Air Force Base to keep him moving around, because it was worried that he was a target too, and that Air Force One was a target. So it was several hours before they had a chance to talk with each other. But Mrs. Bush talks about, as comforting as that was to hear her husband's voice, one of the people she wanted to talk with the most was her own mother, to hear the comfort of her mother's voice. And then obviously to her girls, who had been freshmen. They were freshmen now in college. And Barbara was at home in her dorm room at Yale, and Jenna was at University of Texas at Austin. And so they were scooped up by the Secret Service, and they were evacuated out of their dorms.
Tell us about the first time you saw the President and First Lady after the attack.
I remember the first time I saw the First Lady, which was about 3 or 4 days after the attack. We had set up a blood bank up on the 4th floor of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. The Red Cross came in, because remember, everybody was still in such a state of shock everyone wanted to do something. You felt so helpless. I mean, the images of what we saw in New York, what we saw at the Pentagon, so many people hurt, so many people killed, so many wounded. Blood was desperately needed. And so one of the things that the White House staff did, and what we did in management administration, was organize with the American Red Cross a blood bank in the White House on the 4th floor. And so all the staff could come and give blood. And Mrs. Bush was, the first there to come and greet the Red Cross and to thank the White House staff for stepping in and for helping, and that all of us, we knew, wanted to do something. One of the other things that she had done early on, and I remember, and I wasn't working for her directly, but this was something that told me this is a woman I want to work for someday. She had called a minister, Reverend Kathy Card, who was the wife of the then Chief of Staff, Andy Card. Kathy was is a Methodist minister, and she contacted Kathy to come to her office to meet with all of her staff. Her staff, many young people like your age, Rachel older, a little bit older, but not much, who had moved to Washington to come work in the White House, never thinking for a minute that their lives would be in danger. So they were scared. And so she brought Reverend Card in to sit and meet with her staff, and even the simple act of praying with them and giving them comfort. And all of the rest of us who worked in other offices of the White House had heard that. And I remember thinking then, God, I wish I worked for someone like that who would think to do that, to give us all comfort. Because, we just, particularly in management and administration, we had to jump in because we just had to do our job. Life at the White House changed. We had changed the pass system overnight. We had to change the pass system. We didn't know who had access. Presumably, maybe some of the bad guys had access to our passes and access to the White House. We changed an entire system of getting access to the White House complex, even the color of the passes, a coding system. So many operations had, as I mentioned to you earlier, shutting down one whole side of the White House, moving an entire groups of offices to another location at 18th and G Street. They never came back to work. A lot of those people never came back to work in the White House or in that complex. So just the president, I think I remember the first time that I had seen him was really not until a couple of weeks later. And I was over at the State Department, and we had organized a visit. The president was going to the number of the different agencies who were really directly impacted now and involved in the new global war on terror. Mm-hmm. And he had come to meet with State Department employees. And I remember I was there and I had greeted him, and it was just an embrace and a hug. Because all of us were still reeling from this. But I back up because I do remember something that just escaped me, but I actually saw the president 3 days later. I saw him at a private White House dinner in the residence. He and Mrs. Bush had hosted a 10th anniversary dinner for very good friends of ours. And we were invited. It was a small group. There were only maybe 20 of us there at dinner. And we thought for sure they were going to cancel this dinner. It was September 14th, 3 days later. Mm-hmm. And Mrs. Bush didn't. She felt it was important to have a sense of normalcy around them as much as they possibly could. And these were really, really close friends. So I remember going to that dinner and the president really talking about, how he was fighting a war with an enemy he could not see. And you had to really absorb that at the moment and how scary, that really is and how difficult that really is. We were entering into a new phase in the life of our country and certainly the life of the world. And I remember feeling that a little bit that day. I also remember that night when the evening was over and we were leaving the White House. And we went down in the elevator, go get our car that was on the South Lawn. I was with my husband, and the president rode with us, and his dog, Spot, at the time was still alive. We heard an aircraft above the White House. And, there is no aircraft that's supposed to fly around the White House. And I remember the president looking up and saying, "Is that supposed to be there?" And the agents obviously assured him that it was a surveillance, aircraft. But it just is a reminder of just how vulnerable all of us felt, even the leader of the free world.
Had they briefed you on any sort of protocol for something like this to happen? Did they ever expect an attack like this to happen?
No one expected an attack like this, of course, and this severity. I mean, this was the worst terrorist attack on our soil since 1941 in Pearl Harbor. No one prepared, I think, for something like this. Were there evacuation plans in the event of a fire or things like that? Yes, we knew about them, but nothing to this degree that we were prepared for, and certainly nothing where we had done drills about evacuation. Really, the instructions that were given to the majority of people, particularly the women, were take off your shoes and run. And it was a chaotic time, but it was also one where I think my instincts of having worked in the White House complex so many times before, because remember I worked there for President Reagan, and I was in personnel, and I was director of personnel for President Bush the father, the George H.W. Bush administration. So I knew a lot about the complex, and I knew a lot about operations. So there were some instincts that kicked in for someone like me to help direct people. But certainly after 9/11, a whole new set of protocols were established for the White House and other federal agencies as well, all part of an umbrella called the continuity of operations and continuity of government.
And what is that? Is that just a new set of rules, or is that maybe a new organization to help, or what is it?
It's more that there are procedures that are in place, safe spaces for people to go, underground spaces for people to go in different parts of the complex, more clearly marked exit pathways, more drills that people are doing, a person in each office that's designated an administrative officer that makes sure any changes to procedures are communicated to an entire staff. Remember, there are 1,800, 1,900 people that work within the Eisenhower Executive Office Building complex. So there's 16 different agencies that work within the executive office of the president. So it's not just when we think of the White House, the people in the West Wing and the East Wing. It's an entire complex that comprises several buildings. So there are administrative officers for each department within the White House that were given instructions also to be able to direct staff on what to do for future drills. Also, what were issued to us after 9/11 were something new that we had not had in the two previous times that I had worked there. It's called a VRU unit, and it's called a victims response unit. So it is, and everyone had one at their desk, and it's something that you would take with you in the event of evacuation, in the event of a chemical or biological attack, so that you had a mask to put over your face.
Okay, so it's like a little box with...
It's like a bag. It's almost, and you sling it over your shoulder. It's a yellow bag, and it has a mask that presumably would protect you for a short period of time to exit the building in the event that there was a chemical or biological attack there. It almost looks like a bag you sling over your shoulder that you would, travel with.
Okay. Would you say that those functions being put into place are the biggest changes, or would it be more of an awareness change? What was the biggest change to the White House?
The procedures definitely to be much more, to be a training associated with procedures and more dry runs and drills. That definitely was a big change. The security to the complex changed. We've been seeing security stepped up at the White House for many years, of course, since there was a small plane that flew into the White House when President Clinton was president, that flew right into the South Lawn, almost hit the doctor's office, which is down there on the ground floor. So the perimeter of the White House has been being extended, a security perimeter, for many years. But after 9/11, certainly one of the most immediate things that we did and had to happen, because remember I was in management and administration, so we operated the complex, is we shut down the entire 17th Street side of the Eisenhower Executive Office building. So everybody that was in a building, that was in an office on 17th Street, was evacuated to another. They never came back to those offices, while the building was for almost 7 years being reinforced on that side with bulletproof glass and with other reinforcements that were needed. It also was an opportunity to upgrade the HVAC units, the heating and air conditioning for that side of the building, and to remove the asbestos that was discovered there.
In terms of the coming years, how did the White House change?
White House changed in terms of its entrance procedures, security procedures to get in. Tours were stopped for several months. All public tours were shut down. It was the first time, I think, really in the history of the White House and public tours having to be shut down. The procedures for even coming in on public tours changed from that point forward. Now everybody you couldn't just line up and walk in or get, a ticket that was handed out to you at the White House Visitor Center. Now your name, date of birth, social security number had to be entered through a system through your congressman's office or through a member of the White House staff. So all of the openness that we love as our country, as our democracy, and the White House being the only executive mansion in the world still open to the public, all that changed. Slowly we're getting, back, we're becoming more familiar, obviously, and more comfortable with our new change procedures, and this is life, as we know it now. When you get on an airplane, it's changed. But it was the same for access to the White House, too.
How about the Vice President that day?
So the Vice President was in his office. Obviously, the President was traveling that day to Florida for an event on No Child Left Behind. He was going to a school in Florida. So the Vice President was back in the White House working in his office in the West Wing. As the Vice President has an office also in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. That's where the majority of his staff is. But it is a small ceremonial office in the West Wing of the White House, just steps from the Oval. And that's where he was that day. And the agents, came after the first attack on the first tower. He was moved fairly quickly, picked up by underneath his arms and literally carried down the stairs, the West Wing, over to the East Wing, where the Presidential Emergency Operations Center is.
Why is it important that society remembers this attack?
I think for all new generations of young people in our country need to understand just how fragile our democracy is. We're all responsible for protecting it. We're all responsible for defending it in whatever way that we can, and that our way of life is a way of life that frightens some people around the world. They don't like our freedoms. But we need to, those freedoms are important to us, and they make us who we are. And when we're attacked for them, we need to understand that sometimes some very, very tough decisions have to be made to protect our security and protect our country. And they're not always popular decisions. And I think we also have to remember people who stepped in to sacrifice their lives to try and protect us after this was over. And our country is filled with monuments to the fallen, and we can never forget the fight that continues to protect our democracy and our freedom, and to be able to have conversations like this. So I think, it's important for any of us that are in a university setting, like now I'm in an academic setting at American University. I'm in the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, and we examine a number of things: the role of the presidency vis-a-vis the Congress, and how the two relate with each other or don't. We study the growing influence and role of the American First Lady, and how it's a position that is a partner to the presidency and helps the president execute all of the work that they feel they are responsible for as the leader of the free world. So it's a powerful position. It's one that doesn't have any statutory authority or is not an elected official, but it is truly a partner to the presidency and can be such an effective spokesperson, an ambassador, a representative, both at home and abroad. So I think it's one of the responsibilities we all feel that have lived through that day to really talk about and remember just how vulnerable and under attack that we were and how much we all have to do to tell our story to ourselves, new generations of young people like you, and to the world.
Wow. You are a professor at American University. Studying First Ladies. Can you tell me more about that, what that entails?
Sure. It's actually a really fun opportunity for me, not one that I thought that I would be doing when I left the White House, but I had been approached by American universities just saying they were watching with great interest the growing influence of the First Lady of the United States and how many areas in which they were deployed to help the president. And because remember, I traveled with Mrs. Bush, went to almost 80 countries, much like Mrs. Clinton went to 80 countries as First Lady. And Mrs. Bush was the lead representative for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief. So we went to 15 countries in Africa. We went all over the Middle East. We went to Europe many times. We went on the border of Burma and Thailand on human rights issues. So I think people who were paying attention to the growing influence wanted to formalize some type of study of the role, and American University Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies was the perfect place to do it. So what I did was set about a series of conferences that we put together, bringing experts and historians that have written about First Ladies throughout our history, reporters who had traveled with them in recent times, staff like myself and others who had worked for First Ladies in different capacities. Bringing them all together in partnership with the presidential libraries through the National Archives, and we've been doing a series of conferences around the country, so talking to a diverse group of audiences all over our country about the role of American First Lady through our history, not just the current or even the immediate past First Lady, but throughout our history, the role and influence they have had in so many ways. So it's a fun topic to talk about.
And why is it important that the public is educated about this influence? How will it help us going forward?
I think it helps us also understand just how our government and how our system works, that there's a variety of influences and people that surround the President of the United States that can be actively deployed in the work of our government. I think these are historical figures in our country. Some of them have extremely interesting stories. They're multifaceted. They've been thrust into a position that they maybe didn't necessarily ask for, and they don't even have they're not paid for the position, and they don't have a position description. I think we're fascinated by someone who's that close to the President of the United States, arguably the closest person to the President, and what they do with their time and with the position that they have been given, even if it's not a formalized position. But I think we're interested in their lives, and we're interested in how they utilize this time that they are, for a short snapshot in history, part of the fabric of our country.
Thank you to Anita McBride, and thank you for listening to this edition of Volta Insider. I'm Rachel Greenberg, and follow me on Twitter at Volta Insider. Join us next time. Our guest is Jason Hanley, the Doctor of Music from the Rock and Roll Museum and Hall of Fame. This program is produced by Haddad Media and Feature Story News. Special thanks to Rob Flynn.